An odd story came out of Utah last year. After one competitor outclassed the rest of the field in a high school girls' state-level competition, the parents of the competitors who placed second and third lodged a complaint with the Utah High School Activities Association. It wasn't about performance-enhancing drugs or grade ineligibility or a breach of the rules. It was because the girl who had handily won first place just didn't look feminine enough.
At the time, Utah had not yet passed a law barring transgender athletes from participating in school sports under their correct gender identity. The Athletics Association jumped on it, seemingly very happy to investigate, and tracked down her academic records all the way back to kindergarten without informing her parents. And the evidence showed she had always identified as female. To protect the student's identity, the sport and high school were not named.
As America shifts, this kind of hysteria grows. This is what moral panic looks like. Fear and suspicion abound by inflating uncommon or unusual ideas and lifestyles into social and political emergencies, stoked by an uncertain or outright disparaging populace or media. Transgender people have long been the victim of such panic. It's wrong. 18 states have recently passed transgender athlete bans, and more are in the wings. 4 states have restricted access to gender-affirming care for young people, and more than a dozen are considering restrictions. YouGov recently asked Americans how large they thought certain groups of people were, and respondents thought perhaps as many as 20% of Americans were transgender, when the actual figure is probably around 1%. But unsurprisingly, it's not the first time America has taken explicit action against innocent groups of people in the name of impending danger that must be dealt with right away.
Let's talk about panic. We're seeing fear and distaste exploding out towards trans people today. But it's not new. This kind of fear and distaste in the public reaches so far and so widely, it's even one of the defining traits of the first time the beloved character, Batman, graced the screen. In order to get some perspective, let's go back to World War II. Batman has been many things in the 80 years since the war. A funny crusader in the after-school time slot, a grim-dark murderer of goons, a heck of a great detective read, and a figure to support the wrongful imprisonment of innocent Japanese-American citizens? Hi, I'm Dan.
And I'm Jake, and we're both public high school teachers. During the Second World War, America witnessed a massive shift in its popular culture as the majority of media, films, advertisements, radio, and oftentimes comic books were given a common focus and enlisted into the war effort to help us deal with the fear and the uncertainty of World War II. If there's one superhero character whose rise might be most tied to the events of World War II, it's probably Captain America, who emerged from the minds of legends Joe Simon and Jack Kirby and sprung forth from an iconic 1941 debut cover on which Cap clocks Hitler right in the kisser. Putting Adolf Hitler, a still-living world leader, on the cover of a comic book as the villain was definitely a daring move. The cover to Marvel Mystery Comics number 4 was the first to lampoon the Third Reich. It depicts the submariner saving a woman menaced atop a Nazi submarine and manhandling enemy sailors. But putting Hitler himself as a character on the cover was taking things to a whole new level.
It wasn't long before popular comic book characters were being adapted to other media, starting with serial films. The serial film format was wildly popular in the first half of the 20th century. 10 to 30-minute long episodes were released in successive chapters, and aimed mostly at adolescents through college-age youths. They were often cheap, and always simple. The action hero defeats the evil villain to save the damsel in distress. Kind of like a precursor to the TV show, each chapter was screened before the main feature at a movie theater for 1 week, and it ended with a cliffhanger, in which characters found themselves in perilous situations with little apparent chance of escape. Viewers had to return each week to see the cliffhangers resolved, and to follow the continuing story. Westerns, crime stories, and science fiction, as well as comic book heroes, reigned supreme. One of the most successful serial films of 1943 was Batman's first time on the big screen.
Because the character we know as Batman and his mythos is not nearly as culturally tied to World War II today as a hero like Captain America, it's helpful to get a sense of where the Dark Knight was at this early point in his history. Batman was created during World War II and, at least in his formative years, was used as a mouthpiece for various causes, all with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Batman made his public debut in the May 1939 issue of Detective Comics, issue 27. Robin appeared in the issue of Detective Comics dated April 1940, and the first issue of Batman, his own spin-off comic book, was dated April-May of the same year. Then, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Just 2 years later, the Columbia film serial Batman was released in 1943. One of the prime tasks of the U.S. Office of War Information during 1941 to 1944 was to make every American citizen feel involved in the military effort. World War II was the first movie every American could be in. World War II offered each citizen the dual role of spectator and participant. Batman, the 1943 serial, included.
And there's a moral panic around comics at the time, too. That the superhero was a violent authoritarian figure like Hitler, and the comics were corrupting the minds of youth with sex and murders. The writers adapted. Batman number 3, dated August-September 1940, contained a manifesto titled The Batman Says, which stressed the character's new aims and social ideals, explicitly constructing him as a form of costume teacher or even pastor. The no-nonsense tone was still there, but from here on out, Batman's adventures were clearly no longer to be read as exciting yarns, but as moral lessons. His war against crime has become not just a personal vendetta, but a patriotic duty. Patriotism is often framed as the cure for moral panic. Batman does what he does because he's a good, heteronormative, tax-paying American.
I think Robin and I make it pretty clear that we hate crime and criminals. Why? Because we're proud of being Americans, and we know there's no place in this great country of ours for lawbreakers. That phrase, crime does not pay, has been used over and over again to the point where I hesitate to repeat it. But remember this, it's just as true now as it ever was, and that's plenty true. Robin and I hope that our adventures may help put over that fact. We'd like to feel that our efforts may help every youngster to grow up into an honest, useful citizen. If you do this, if you are definitely on the side of law and order, then Robin and I salute you and are glad to number you among our friends.
Superman 2 was put through subtle changes to tame some rougher edges and transform him into a more unambiguously patriotic hero. As Superman's co-creator Jerry Siegel remembers it, he was explicitly asked to remodel his character after Batman in terms of shifting Superman's focus from social reform, like fighting slum landlords, for instance, to a less ambivalent form of crime fighting. An ironic move when we consider that the Superman of the last 50 years often plays the naively moralistic Boy Scout to Batman's darker form of justice. Keep in mind, we're not saying the Batman serial is the only piece of media jumping on the anti-Axis bandwagon. It's an ever-present propaganda monologue, and it's clear everywhere at the time. Information, inspiration, and sometimes just plain scaremongering. By 1943, reports Anthony Rhodes of Propaganda, The Art of Persuasion, of the 20 NBC serials which went out weekly, only 5 were unconnected to the war.
So, what are these serial films, actually? The 1943 Columbia serial is a series of 15 black and white chapters, titled simply Batman, and it stars Lewis Wilson as Bruce Wayne and Batman, and Douglas Croft as Dick Grayson and Robin in the lead roles. With the exception of a longer first and last chapter, they're all about 16 to 18 minutes long, and feature the dynamic duo fighting an evil underground crime syndicate, with lots of silly fighting and acrobatics and a few jokes. Shirley Patterson plays Linda Page, the love interest for Bruce Wayne, and a damsel in distress in later chapters. If we get to keep our description to those general terms, it's fine. It's fine.
The incomparable Batman on the big theater screen.
It has the makings of an alright detective story. The depictions of Batman and Robin are pretty different from what we're used to.
Let's wait around and see Captain Arnold's face when he gets here.
No time for that. Don't forget, I've got a date. Let's go.
Lewis Wilson is nothing like the deep-voiced Kevin Conroy, R.I.P., or Christian Bale that have defined what Batman is for the modern day. Batman does some actual detective work in his lab and punches a whole lot of goons in some weird fight scenes.
We've only ever seen one other non-Batman serial film all the way through, and that's the Crimson Ghost serial. But long, dopey fight scenes sure do seem to be the norm. The long fights do definitely feel like they're there to pad out the runtime, though, because each one opens with about 2 minutes of the fight scene that ended the last serial before you get to see the plot advance at all. Alongside Batman, Douglas Croft is a pretty fun Robin, and it's cool that he was actually an age-appropriate 16 when playing him.
You frighten as easily as our spineless friend downstairs.
And we only had to use a few of our tricks to get him to talk.
Even though that big, curly mop top of hair is not exactly what you'd expect for Dick Grayson. Side note, I always thought that's just what Douglas Croft's hair looked like, but that's a wig. So the producers were definitely going for something.
A lot of people in recent years have noted that the serial films were more influential than they're remembered for. They were the first to introduce the Bat's Cave.
Come along, fella. You're going with us to the Bat's Cave. Here we are, home sweet home.
And its secret entrance through a grandfather clock. When Alfred Pennyworth, Bruce's butler, was introduced in a 1943 comic book, he was a bumbling, portly fellow. But the serial films reintroduced him as a slimmer man with a thin mustache. And that's mostly how he's been portrayed in the 80 years since. Remember in Batman v Superman, where Batman burns a bunch of bat brands into his victims? In this one, they stick these cute little bat-shaped stickers to their foreheads, so I'm choosing to believe that Zack Snyder ripped that off from here. Unfortunately, that's where the fun stops.
The evil crime syndicate that the Caped Crusaders fight in this serial is led by not the Joker, not Two-Face, not Catwoman or Penguin, all of whom had already been created by 1943. No, we got Dr. Tito Dacca. Dr. Dacca, or sometimes referred to as Prince Dacca in the serial, is essentially an evil mad scientist who has a plan to turn people into mindless zombies and use a death ray to kidnap wealthy businessmen to take over America. Dr. Dacca is also an awful, disgusting Japanese stereotype. We're introduced to him with his minions bringing a kidnapped man into their lair, the House of the Open Door. The entrance to his lair is through a dark ride called the Japanese Cave of Horrors, which is staffed by men posing as hyper-patriots who say things like a portion of your entry fee goes to Uncle Sam.
Exhibit in all of England and France. Now the price of admission is only 10 cents. Plus 1 cent tax for Uncle Sam.
The displays in this ride are mannequins of Japanese soldiers holding Americans captive and forcing them to do hard labor. Inside the inner chambers, Dr. Dacca's lair features a mishmash of Asian imagery and a gigantic Buddha statue positioned right behind him. And you already saw this coming, but yes, Dr. Dacca is not played by a Japanese man. He's played by a white American actor in yellowface, doing an offensive, stereotypical accent.
But if the truth were known...
The fact remains that you have been dishonored. Exactly like our friend Mr. Fletcher here. An excellent architect, brilliant engineer. Except that some of his buildings did not quite come up to specifications.
We've actually been aware of Dr. Dacca as a character for pretty much as long as we can remember. When we were kids, we had this VHS tape of a documentary/celebration of Batman that was produced on a low budget about the time the Tim Burton Michael Keaton film was released in 1989, and it provided a short history of the old serials. It calls J. Carrol Naish, who plays Dr. Dacca, a versatile dialect specialist.
Batman and Robin were fighting against evil genius Dr. Dacca, played by J. Carrol Naish. Naish was a versatile dialect specialist who often performed in character roles,
and only mentions the film's racism as anti-Japanese sentiment that is sprinkled throughout the film.
This serial has been out of print for a while due to the anti-Japanese sentiment that's sprinkled throughout the film.
It's a heck of an understatement that improperly characterizes how much of a propaganda film this is.
Dr. Dacca is not just a mad scientist, but he's explicitly said to be taking orders from the Emperor Hirohito, destined to destroy the United States and free the enslaved Americans.
I am Dr. Daka, humble servant of His Majesty Hirohito, heavenly ruler and prince of the rising sun. By divine destiny, my country shall destroy the democratic forces of evil in the United States to make way for the new order. An order that will bring about the liberation of the enslaved people of America.
The recap that plays at the start of the second chapter terms him a sinister Japanese underground agent.
Prince Daka, sinister Japanese underground agent, has conspired to steal a cache of powerful radium.
And it is no coincidence that Dr. Daka is shown as extremely morally weak and doesn't even put up a fight to give up his secret knowledge at the end of the last chapter.
Is it possible to restore Miss Page to a normal condition?
It is, by me.
All right, Daka. Take your choice. Either bring her back to her senses or become a zombie yourself.
My choice is obvious.
Whereas most of the captured goons at least resisted Batman's interrogation at first, under the threat of getting eaten alive by vampire bats in the Batcave. His kidnapped businessmen are all in some way disgraced, and thus forced into helping him. And it just gets worse from there. All of the white characters liberally use slurs when encountering Dr. Daka, and episodes carry titles like Doom of the Rising Sun and Slaves of the Rising Sun. Rather than being driven by the death of his parents to fight crime, this version of Bruce Wayne is a government agent. Seriously, Robin and Batman are G-men who have been enlisted into the war effort, specifically as anti-Japanese espionage agents.
Okay, let's pause right here to cover something important. This whole thing, the depiction of Dr. Daka, the placement of Japanese people as enemies of the state, the accent, etc., it's wrong. It was wrong then, it's wrong now. We encountered a lot of this in our Elvis movies video, as well as when covering roles where Elvis's skin was darkened or reddened. Viewers seemed to think that because the actors didn't have a problem playing the role and that the sentiment was common, that it's excusable. It's not. Like, the preeminent example, Mickey Rooney's Mr. Yunioshi, a buck-toothed man with a loud, thick, fake Asian accent, excused his portrayal because it was funny. Some of this was the Hays Code, some of it was box office calculation, and some was just plain ignorance. According to the Pew Research Center, about a third of Americans say blackface as a Halloween costume is acceptable, which is pretty worrying.
But aren't actors supposed to act and be someone else? Does that mean that making you look taller for a role where you have to play a basketball player is also wrong? No. Blackface, yellowface, and so on are used to mock, dehumanize, and stereotype people of color. At its most benign, the characters are used for laughs. At its worst, the characters are used to denigrate entire groups of innocent people.
Dr. Daka doesn't just happen to be a Japanese villain during wartime against Japan. The film pretty explicitly places him as a proxy for Japan, and Batman as a proxy for America winning the war. As Batman and Robin are being introduced at the start of the first chapter, the voiceover explains that they represent American youth who love their country and are glad to fight for it.
Wherever crime raises its ugly head to strike with the venom of a maddened rattlesnake, Batman and Robin strike also. And in this very hour when the Axis criminals are spreading their evil over the world, even within our own land, Batman and Robin stand ready to fight them to the death.
In the fourth chapter, one of the kidnapped Americans tells off Dr. Daka from the winning side, and I can only imagine this was supposed to come across like a badass monologue or something.
Someone else to place you.
That's okay with me. I'm fed up with your new order anyhow. Maybe the rest of these stooges lead up that applesauce, but I know different. I don't need any handwriting on the wall to tell me who's going to come out on top in this war, because it's written as plain and black as death in every newspaper. That's what I came back to tell you, because I'm not afraid of you. You've shot your boat, Daka. You and all your Axis cronies. You're through.
Are we?
I'm quoting from the winning side, Daka.
And when he thinks he's beaten Dr. Daka, he continues to be super racist, right before Dr. Daka feeds the guy to his pet alligators.
Are you going to open that door and let me out? Or would you like a quick visit to your ancestors?
But of course you can go.
That's the kind of answer that fits the color of your skin.
People have actually guessed through the years that Dr. Dacca wasn't originally supposed to be such a horrible stereotype, that he might have originally been intended to be the Joker, as evidenced by some early posters, as well as the fact that Dr. Dacca's costume is rather similar to the Joker's suit, and placing his lair in a funhouse ride is very on brand for the Clown Prince of Crime. That would have been so much better. You could even still have him working against America and just not be really, really racist about it.
This all sucks. The serial makes some pretty obvious continuity errors, too. In its very first episode, Batman clearly doesn't know who Dr. Dacca is.
Dacca will make you regret this.
Shut up!
Dr. Dacca? Who's that?
But in a later chapter, he says that he remembers when Dr. Dacca killed the government agents who tried to deport him 2 years ago.
If you value your life, you better address me as Dr. Dacca.
I know who you are. We've been searching for you ever since you killed those 2 agents assigned to your deportation.
And it shouldn't be surprising that the movie is also racist against Native Americans, with this weird one-off character in Chapter 8 named Steve of Steve's Indian Trading Post. It's disappointing, because seeing a 1940s version of Batman fight a crime ring sounds very much worth the watch, and the entrance to a supervillain's secret lair being hidden in a funhouse ride is a genuinely awesome, campy idea. It's interesting how nobody stumbled on the operation, though. Dr. Dacca's lair is able to be hidden for so long by being in Little Tokyo's section of Gotham City, which has been nearly abandoned because...
This was part of a foreign land transplanted bodily to America and known as Little Tokyo. Since a wise government rounded up the shifty-eyed it has become virtually a ghost street where only one business survives, eking out a precarious existence on the dimes of curiosity seekers.
Wait, what?
Since a wise government rounded up the shifty-eyed it has become virtually a ghost street.
Yeah, Batman's an agent of Japanese internment.
Japanese internment is a shameful chapter in American history that hasn't been explored, grappled with, or taught nearly as much as it should. Whenever we bring it up to high school students in the classroom, they are 90% of the time shocked that such a thing existed and nobody's told them about it before. Heck, adults respond the same way.
Japanese internment was an American program during World War II in which the federal government, empowered by an executive order from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, rounded up and forcibly relocated and wrongfully imprisoned people of Japanese descent in the United States. We're very careful to be using the term people of Japanese descent here, because many of the people incarcerated were absolutely Americans. They were born in America. They had never known any other home but the United States. Upon President Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066 on February 19th, 1942, people who had already been termed undesirables and had been spied on for the previous 3 years were now being forcibly removed from the western coast of the United States to remote places further inland.
These 125,000 or more people were imprisoned at 75 different concentration camps run by the War Relocation Authority, most of which were located on the West Coast in places like the California desert. The most famous of them is the Manzanar War Relocation Center. Author Jean Wakatsuki Houston turned her time in Manzanar into her memoir, Farewell to Manzanar, which recounts the childhood she spent in the camp. Jean, contrary to what the American government thought at the time, was not plotting against the American war effort because she was, and I can't emphasize this enough, 7 fucking years old. Japanese internment imprisoned people of Japanese descent regardless of age or the specifics of their job or background, and kept them in prison camps in which poor living conditions and heavy watch were features, not bugs.
You may be familiar with at least one victim of Japanese internment, George Takei, who would grow up to play the helmsman of the Starship Enterprise, Hikaru Sulu, on a little clinker of a science fiction television show called Star Trek. George and his family were taken to a horse stable, where they were forced to live for several months until they were trucked to Arkansas and arrived at the Rower internment camp. George describes the extremely undignified way in which his fellow incarcerated Americans were treated, being even denied the right to be called citizens, with the camp administration and the army instead calling them enemy non-aliens. non-aliens.
Now that's a very peculiar term, non-alien. It means a citizen. We couldn't even be called enemy citizens.
When George's parents refused to sign a loyalty oath to the United States because of its duplicitous and insulting nature, they were sent to the even more hostile Tule Lake camp in Northern California.
They've taken everything, but there's one thing that they can't take, and that's my dignity. I am not going to grovel before this government. And he answered no to those two questions.
We've come to what's left of Camp Amache in the southeastern corner of Colorado to see a Japanese internment camp's relics. Amache's actual name is the Grenada Relocation Center, and it's just a few miles west of Colorado's Kansas border by the town of Grenada in Prowers County. Clearly, there's a lot that we could talk about involving Japanese mass incarceration, but Amache is the only site that's within visiting distance of us, and we've seen much written about camps like Manzanar and Tule Lake, and we haven't seen much written about Amache, so we'll stick mostly with it.
In August 1942, with the camp still being built, families began to arrive by train. Between 1942 and 1945, over 10,000 people were incarcerated at Amache, and most of them were American citizens. Japanese American historical societies, museums, and the National Park Service agree that it's accurate to characterize the camps like Amache as concentration camps similar to the ones run by Nazi Germany. There were no death camps, but they absolutely were centers of hard labor and excessive guarding of people who were forcibly, unjustly removed from their homes. Amache in particular was completely surrounded by barbed wire fencing, and 8 machine gun towers dotted the edge of the camp. Life in Japanese internment camps was purposefully difficult in order to counteract persistent rumors that the War Relocation Authority was coddling incarcerees. Families were housed in long cell blocks, oftentimes with several families to one small area, separated only by a bedsheet or a curtain.
If you've ever been to southern Colorado, you know that it can be extremely hot and dry in the summer, and it's technically a desert climate. This provided additional challenges for a lot of Americans who were being forcibly relocated from California's coastal climate. It was tough for a lot of the incarcerees, especially with the high winds of the plains and the severe dust storms, but with most people at Amache working in agriculture, they found a way to make farms work. In fact, they were so successful that they were able to feed everyone in the camp and send surplus food supplies to the U.S. Army, sending 4 million pounds of veggies in 1943 alone. Our grandpa, who lived in the area and would have been about 10 at the time Amache opened, once recalled to us that their Japanese American neighbors were able to get things to grow that the white farmers were never able to. From where we're at right now, it's pretty easy to tell that Amache was built on a hill. There's not a whole lot to see out here, but you get a pretty good view with the town of Grenada in the background behind me, and the top of the hill over here with the water tower.
Amache was pretty close to the small town of Grenada, and the incarcerees were able to walk there and back, with pretty good relations to the town people of Grenada, who even stocked items in stores specific to their Japanese American customers. Lamar, which isn't a big town but is definitely the biggest in the area, was quite a bit more hostile to the creation of the camp and its residents, although some of the businesses were glad that it brought them some cash during the construction. The Denver Post itself was particularly and vehemently against the people at Amache, publishing, "The Post will never agree. that while Japanese barbarians are murdering Americans, we should coddle and pet and pamper Japanese enemies here in the United States.
Keep in mind, many of these people were Americans. All of them were innocent.
There was remarkable resilience in the camp, and the incarcerees made great strides to improve the living standards there. They established a police department and a fire department, both staffed by Japanese-American incarcerees. They established a silkscreen shop and actually printed over 250,000 posters for the Navy. There was a hospital, and most of the staff were incarcerated Japanese-Americans. Though wages were low, and much lower than the white staff, people at the camp actually pooled money to help fill out wages. There was a bi-weekly newspaper established called the Grenada Pioneer, and not only was it printed in both English and Japanese, it was delivered free of charge to every single block and became a central pillar of the community. They attempted to build schools for the primary-age kids through high school, but building multiple buildings was blocked because educating these American school children was seen as coddling the enemy, so only a high school was built.
The younger grades held classes in a converted barracks block, and boys had the opportunity to join a Boy Scout group. The high school, though, being brand new, was actually the biggest and nicest looking in the area, which fueled accusations of coddling the incarcerees. In actuality, Minoru Tanai recalls that the high school may have looked good from a distance, but it was made of the same temporary wall materials of the residential barracks and was quite flimsy. One badass student named Thomas Shigekuni apparently once ended the Pledge of Allegiance in school by saying, "With liberty and justice for all but us in the camp," and was sent to the principal's office. At the high school, Minoru Tanai also remembers that they had a number of extracurriculars, clubs, prom, a yearbook, and even a football team. Amache's high school appears to have only lost one football game in its 3 years of operation. Most surrounding high schools refused to come to Amache to play on their home field, except for one game against the nearby town of Holly. Holly's football team agreed to come to Amache and to play as the visiting team. They played on Amache's home turf, and they lost, making the Amache High School the only high school football team in Colorado history to be undefeated at home.
There were a number of remarkable people who were imprisoned at Amache for a time, including future Congressman Mike Honda, jazz artist and Oregon Poet Laureate Lawson Fusao Inada, painters Yuriko Nakai and Emiko Nakano, photographer Yashihiro Ishimoto, Medal of Honor recipient Kiyoshi Kei Muranaga, screen printer Arthur Okamura, actors Sab Shimono and Pat Suzuki, and lawyer Chiyoko Sakamoto.
Toward the end of Japanese internment, people had the option to leave the camp by going to college or acquiring a leave clearance. The clearance asked some insulting, racist questions, like if the person leaving the camp would stay away from large groups of Japanese people, whether they would Americanize their habits and their dress, and provide information on subversive activity. Toward the end of the war, the government ban that excluded Japanese Americans from the West Coast was rescinded, saying, "Those persons of Japanese ancestry whose records have stood the test of Army scrutiny will be permitted the same freedom of movement throughout the United States as other loyal citizens and law-abiding aliens." Although hard fighting is ahead in the Pacific, it can no longer be said, as it could be said in 1942, that an enemy invasion on the West Coast on a large scale is a substantial possibility. Incarcerees were not eager to leave Amache due to rumors that Japanese Americans were being treated with great hostility, though people did gradually return to California or seek out new homes elsewhere.
The Grenada Pioneer published, "The courage displayed by your boys on America's fighting fronts was a prime factor in the achievement of this goal. Your old home state and the rest of continental America is now open to most of you. Do not let resentment, inertia, or a sense of frustration blind you to the fact that the closing of the centers is a consummation devoutly to be wished. The center, any center, is not a good place to live. I know it, and you know it." On August 15th, 1945, Japan surrendered, bringing World War II to an end, and Amache closed exactly 2 months later.
I guess the thing that gets me every time I look into Japanese internment is just the Americanness of it all. The people in photos getting off trains or staffing buildings or going to dances, they're Americans. The The boys have grease in their hair. The girls are wearing American dresses. They're celebrating Christmas, just like we do today. They have a Boy Scout troop. They're flying the American flag, and people are actively contributing to the effort to help their country win the war, despite being incarcerated by that very country. One of the only ways out of the camps was through military service, and many incarcerees did go on to serve in the United States Army. Not only that, but the most highly decorated military unit of World War II was the 442nd Infantry Regiment, which was entirely Japanese Americans. It's so hard for us not to feel angry as we look at these pictures of United States citizens being wrongfully imprisoned by their own government for no crime, just for their ethnicity.
In 1994, Amache was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and then was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2006. On March 18th of 2022, President Biden signed the Amache National Historic Site Act, making it one of 3 National Historic Sites in Colorado, along with the site of the Sand Creek Massacre and Bensold Fort, both of which we visited for episodes of this show. In fact, we drove right by Sand Creek on the way to Amache and drove by Bent's Fort on the way home.
So this 1940s version of Batman is a secret agent working to further racist programs put forth by the American government. He and Robin are G-men rounding up innocent people and putting them in concentration camps. This is made even weirder by the fact that Robin actor Douglas Croft would go on to serve in the United States Army during World War II after this. Even Bob Kane, Batman's co-creator, who is by most accounts a scheming, selfish jackass, dismissed the 1943 serial as a crude propaganda vehicle. The serial's legacy is deservedly mixed, but deserves to be more infamous than it is. The second Batman serial, titled Batman and Robin, and released in 1949, is also a mixed bag. It has worse costumes and different actors playing Batman and Robin, both of whom are a little more wooden than in the 43 film.
Invisible ink. I'll change and go entertain Vicky.
You better be careful. I think she's beginning to get wise that Batman and Bruce Wayne are the same.
Well, if she gets too close, we know how to throw her off the track.
But hey, at least it's not a racist propaganda movie. Strangely enough, Dr. Dacca recently made his comic book debut, thankfully stripped of all the racist elements. His reintroduction has cast him as this campy hypnotist, which makes sense due to his zombifying people in the serial film. Good choice, DC.
Batman and Robin are the modern equivalent of folk figures. As part of our collective folklore, they're bound to get reinterpreted. So when someone on the internet gets mad at Jean Luen Yang's Superman smashes the Klan, or doesn't like when a character gets reinterpreted as another race or in some way changes, know that change is a constant with these characters. There are people we're more inclined to agree with too, who will make the argument that actually all comic characters have always been inherently progressive. But that's clearly not true either.
Characters like Batman will continue to be reinterpreted as long as they exist. Some of those interpretations we'll like, and some of them we won't. But it would be short-sighted to say that any of them don't tell us something about ourselves and about our culture.
We're seeing reflections of this fear and panic playing out today, so let's bring it back to the present. Stories like the one we started with. Driven by right-wing fear-mongering and talking heads, fears are currently being stoked about the trans community. Just as we look back at the demonic depictions of Asian Americans during and after World War II, people with power are questioning whether or not trans people should be allowed to exist and have freedom. Unhinged conspiracy theories have permeated the news about trans folks, which has been pretty deeply covered by the likes of local Denver reporter for KUSA, Kyle Clark, as well as national pundits like John Oliver. In our state, candidate for governor Heidi Ganahl torpedoed her own campaign by continually doubling down on the absolutely wild assertion that schools not only allow students to come to class dressed in furry costumes, but they use litter boxes that are just sitting in the classroom or an office. If you just say it out loud, you know it's ridiculous. Ganahl lost by almost 20 points.
Sorry, Heidi, but never seen a student relieve themselves in my class. But I do have a Home Depot bucket of kitty litter in my classroom. It's hidden away in a cabinet. It's there for the most depressing reason possible. If we are ever in a lockdown situation for so long that it becomes necessary that students need to use the restroom, I have that. It's also full of snacks for students who are diabetic, sanitary products, and first aid materials. It keeps the public from talking about real problems like school funding and post-pandemic reading scores that are plummeting, and it firmly plants the conversation around the culture wars. People like Heidi Ganahl look to us like the backwards movie execs putting a racist La Migra version of Batman on film. We aren't uniquely equipped to deal with these questions of moral panic more than anyone else, but at least we can provide some perspective. This is one of the major things that we like about examining media like this. It helps us see how art reflects our society.
This doesn't just stop at fear-mongering. Let's end it by bringing it back to Batman and how he reflects evolving thoughts in our national consciousness. Specifically, let's look at law enforcement as an example. In the 1943 serial, Batman is a government agent working for a nationalistic cause, and it's presented as an important moral one. Though he doesn't exactly work with the police, he definitely works alongside them.
Now, Satan, I have a nice little package for you. You'll find it at the corner of 1st and Maple.
The police in the serial are portrayed as mostly upstanding, though maybe a bit bumbling. In the 1960s series and in the 66 film, Batman and Robin are fully deputized officers of the law and work as valued members of the police force. They're wholly righteous custodians of justice, as is every cop in the show.
Yes? Put any fears you may have had aside, Commissioner. We're back in action.
Batman! Batman! The answer to a policeman's prayer!
In the Christopher Nolan films from 2005 to 2012, Batman does what the police can't, and the films subscribe to the bad apples model of justice, implying that the system is inherently good, but it's just mucked up by bureaucracy and a few squeaky wheels. In Matt Reeves' most recent The Batman film, the power system is rotten to its core, and even though a facelift is offered in the form of a quote-unquote progressive candidate, it's implied that the new people running the system wouldn't actually be able to make any lasting changes because the system is so corrupt. This is one of our favorite aspects of talking about movies, what they show us about ourselves.
So, panic. It's happened time and again. Fears about Asian Americans during the war. Fears about goth kids post-Columbine. Fears about mythical migrant caravans that no one has pictures or videos of that miraculously disappear after elections. If history tells us anything, it's that we don't have to be afraid of that group of people that is not well understood. They're not picking my pocket, and they're not breaking my leg. The goth kids didn't ruin the world. The migrant caravans never show. Asian Americans were not the enemy in World War II. That girl in the state tournament we mentioned at the beginning wasn't the villain, even though she didn't look feminine enough. The trans community is not the enemy now. They're trying to live their lives, and if we're going to live up to that American dream that is so pervasive in these old comic books, we should get out of the way, and we should let them live.
Thanks for watching, and if you made it this far, thanks for subscribing. You don't have to agree 100% with the philosophy of each Batman rendition to enjoy it, and some of the worst Batman movies are the most interesting, philosophically speaking. We'd love to hear your thoughts on your favorite Batman from a societal, crime-fighting aspect. Maybe instead of just asking which one is the best or whether we should restore the Snyderverse, let's ask what Batman tells us about ourselves.